The history of Africa is not as accessible to us as the history of Europe or Asia. Before the arrival of the first Europeans, towards the end of the 15th century, that part of Africa that lies to the south of the Sahara Desert was almost completely unknown outside the Islamic world. Indeed, for several centuries, it was widely believed amongst Europeans that Africa had no history. But, were that the case, who was responsible for the Nok terracottas made in Nigeria some 2,000 years ago? And who cast these magnificent bronzes at Ife and Benin? The truth is that Africa produced a number of states, civilizations and empires in the centuries before the Europeans arrived, especially along the coastal plains of East Africa and in West Africa to the south of the Sahara. Few of them developed any writing of their own, however, which is one of the problems facing historians trying to chart their rise and fall. Today, after emerging from centuries of colonial rule, all of Africa's 50 or so nations are quite definitely young countries. But man as we know him first emerged here over 2 million years ago in what is now Tanzania. Much later, Egypt gave birth to one of the world's earliest advanced civilizations. Today, the same river that saw the rise of that early civilization, the Nile, is the lifeblood of one of Africa's most remote and mysterious peoples, the Dinka. These Dinka women gather fish from the flooded plains of the Sudan in the same way their ancestors may have done when that first Egyptian civilization itself was in existence. In this sense, Africa today exists in a time warp that is both fascinating and perplexing. And indeed, until recent times, Africa and its peoples remained a mystery to the outside world. To Europeans, it was the dark continent. Its different nations and tribes were largely seen as one, at best children, at worst savages. Such attitudes helped to ease the conscience of successive generations of colonialists and earlier of the slave traders. For more than 3 centuries, Europe indulged in this barbarous market in human flesh. True, Europeans hadn't started it, but they introduced new, efficient methods, packing generations of Africa's children into ships like this one, where they were fettered together, unable to move or stand throughout the long voyage to America. The Portuguese called these ships tumbeiros, meaning coffins, and by the 18th century, over 70,000 slaves were being transported every year, taking their culture and much of their history with them. During the 20th century, and especially since the end of the colonial period, that history and culture is being rediscovered, both by Africans themselves and by outsiders. The dominant Victorian view of Africa, that it was a land of unrelieved savagery and chaos, now seems to say more about the Victorian empire builders themselves than it does about the peoples of this vast continent. As Africa emerges painfully into the 20th century, it can now be clearly seen that its peoples have created cultures and civilizations, have evolved systems of thought and pursued the inner life of the spirit with a consuming passion, which has made an important contribution to contemporary culture. To understand the history of Africa, we must first know something of its geography. 3 times the size of the United States, Africa covers some 30 million square kilometers. Much of it is extraordinarily inaccessible. The coastline is rarely broken by bays, gulfs, or inland seas. Of all the great rivers, only the Nile is easily navigable from the sea. There is no Mediterranean or Baltic to assist penetration. This is because most of the continent is a vast plateau, broken by broad interior basins which stretch almost to the coast in many places. Where access is easier, in the desert areas and equatorial forests, the extremes of climate make life difficult or impossible for human beings who are not acclimatized to it, and Africa's vegetation is as varied as its topography. Along the equator run the tropical rainforests. Next come the woodlands and savanna. Then there are the great dry grasslands, and finally the deserts. In the south, Kalahari, to the north, Sahara. In terms of Africa's history, the Sahara Desert is the most significant feature of all. Before 3000 BC, much of the area now called the Sahara was green and fertile. Its peoples were first of all hunters, and later herders of cattle. They produced societies and cultures that were both stable and developed. Then disastrous climatic changes from about 3000 BC onwards destroyed the fertile pasture lands as the Sahara Desert expanded. The Sahara was not, of course, wholly impenetrable. A few nomadic peoples remained there, around isolated oases, like the Tubu, now facing extinction from the twin threats of drought and war. In addition, camel trains have crossed the desert since ancient times, following known routes and with very specific objectives connected with trade. But to depart into the unknown was usually fatal. The Greek historian Herodotus, writing about 450 BC, records the story of a military detachment on patrol only 7 days' march west of the Nile that was overtaken by a sandstorm and buried while the men were taking their midday meal. Similar freak storms still afflict the area today, turning the midday sun to dusk in a matter of minutes. Following the climatic change, the Stone Age peoples who had developed there dispersed. Some went north and east and contributed to the development of Egyptian civilization. In contrast, the societies that migrated south of the Sahara became more and more isolated as the desert grew. They became part of Black Africa. There is another, less obvious division in African history between the powerful political entities, the states, kingdoms and nations, and the rural, nomadic peoples, many of whom follow lifestyles today that are little changed since the time of their ancestors. Remote, semi-nomadic peoples like the Dinka of the Sudan now find their survival threatened by the modern Africa that surrounds them. Faced with such a threat, it's small consolation that their way of life has long outlived the more flamboyant and splendid lifestyle of the great African kingdoms and empires, none of which has survived the arrival of the Europeans. Two of the leading early civilizations of Africa developed in the northeast of the continent: Egypt, with its capital at Alexandria, and Ethiopia, with its capital from the 1st century AD at Aksum. Ethiopia was converted to Christianity in the 4th century, and Aksum remained an important cultural and trading center until about the 9th century AD, when she was defeated by Muslim invaders. Today, these stelae, up to 30 meters high and carved from single slabs of rock, remain to remind the world of the once mighty city of Aksum. The capital of Ethiopia was moved south into the mountains, eventually to Lalibela. There, King Lalibela ordered churches to be cut out of the living rock. Some of these churches are still in use today. Archaeology shows that in West Africa, in the savanna country beyond the southern edge of the Sahara, iron was in use from about 400 BC onwards. During the next 1,000 years, its use spread throughout Africa to a multitude of different sites. Following the introduction of iron, trade in West Africa developed on a substantial scale, and a succession of states and urban centers rose and fell. Ghana, Mali, Songhai, Hausa, Kanem-Bornu. The trade of this area expanded dramatically after about AD 1000, using the well-defined trade routes across the Sahara Desert. One of the most important towns at the southern end of these routes was Timbuktu in the Kingdom of Mali. Timbuktu was a university town as well as a trading center. So important were learning and ideas, in fact, that her merchants made more money from trade in books than they did from anything else. By AD 1000, Islam had the whole of North Africa and the states bordering the southern Sahara in its grasp. Mali was just one state that had benefited from its links with Islam. It had become very prosperous, and in 1324 its Sultan, Mansa Musa, went on an ostentatious pilgrimage to Mecca, showering gold about him as he went. So famous did this journey become that Mansa appears in this map made in Christian Mallorca in 1375. A little to the south, the 14th century saw the rise of one of Africa's most powerful kingdoms, Benin. The bronzes produced at Benin, like this 16th century head of a queen mother, are outstanding. 3 centuries earlier, a little to the north, the sculptors of Ife had cast this head of a young man. Both works are a remarkable testament to the artists who produced them. The Bini inhabitants of Benin had no written language, but descriptions of their advanced society can be found in the journals of early explorers. In addition, they left these bronze plaques as a vivid memorial to their lifestyle. Their king, or Oba, ruled as an absolute monarch, capable of mobilizing 100,000 men at a day's notice. He sent representatives to the Portuguese court. His merchants were the shrewdest of businessmen. The Portuguese were full of admiration for what they saw, as were the Dutch who came later. To please these early European visitors, the artists of Benin produced masterpieces in ivory, like this salt cellar, carved in the late 15th century. It depicts the sailors and merchants to whom it was designed to appeal. At the time, such souvenirs would have been produced in large numbers and would have cost about the same as a good shirt. The Europeans who bought these earliest souvenirs of a trip of a lifetime also cleared the way for the start of the slave trade. Gradually, this unnatural commercial pressure destroyed the social and economic framework of Benin. The Obas, or kings, responded to the decline of their kingdom in the only way they knew how, by carrying out more and more human sacrifices. When a British force arrived in Benin City in 1897, they found it deserted and littered with the decaying remains of human sacrificial victims. Benin, city of regal splendor and home of Black Africa's most noble art, had passed into history. History still holds the secrets of the creators of these hauntingly mysterious heads, dating from between 500 BC and AD 200. Discovered by archaeologists some 40 years ago, they were named the Nok terracottas, after the village in Nigeria where they were first unearthed. This ram is another fine example of Bini bronze work. More recent tribal art, in clay, ivory, and most especially wood, also emanates mainly from West Africa. These outstanding examples are to be found in museums and galleries. However, Africa is still producing tribal art today, not primarily to entertain or to please, nor to be admired as art objects, but to meet precise social requirements within the society in which it is produced. All these figures are religious or magical in purpose. Away from the more settled communities of West Africa, the nomads of the East produce portable art that will not weigh them down in their journey. The Maasai of Kenya are just one people who wear their art on their bodies. The coast of East Africa also supported powerful urban civilizations between 500 and 1,000 years ago. They exported gold, frankincense, skins and ivory from the African hinterland to Arabia and to India. Notable amongst them were the cities of Kilwa and Gedi. Their dhows sailed with the monsoon winds of the Indian Ocean, following the seasons, and returning with the carpets of Isfahan and Gujarat, the ceramics of China and Persia, the horses of Arabia, and the cottons of India. In 1418 and again in 1422, they were visited by powerful Chinese fleets, whose commanders were curious to verify the rumors of the city's wealth. And it was the same stories of unbounded riches that a century later attracted the caravels of the Portuguese, whose artillery quickly destroyed forever these dangerous trading rivals. On their ruins they built fortresses to ensure that there would be no recovery. These mighty walls are all that remain of another vanished African civilization. And yet, in the 14th century, Great Zimbabwe must have been one of the most powerful and impressive states in southern Africa, deriving its wealth from gold and ivory, as well as extensive mineral deposits in the surrounding country. The men who built Great Zimbabwe were of Bantu stock. The Bantu are today the most dominant racial group in Africa. About 1800 years ago, they began to spread from their homeland in the Cameroon, southwards to the Congo Basin, until they dominated most of southern Africa. The people they displaced, the San and Hoi, were pushed southwards. They were hunters and the Bantu were mainly farmers. Small numbers of San have survived in the Kalahari Desert. In the caves of southern Africa, their ancestors have left a vivid testament to their way of life. Cattle have always been a symbol of wealth and well-being in Africa, and they still are today. The Maasai, who live in southern Kenya and northern Tanzania, measure wealth in terms of cattle and children, although money does now have its uses as well. But it's relatively unimportant still in a society that is so essentially rootless. The Maasai live their lives around their cattle. They believe that all the cattle on earth belong to them, and that they were put on earth by God to tend to their needs. Non-Africans may be tempted to see the history of the continent in terms of the rise and fall of states and empires, but that is only part of the truth. There is another side to Africa's history, and it can still be seen today in the lifestyles of the nomadic peoples. Sadly, however, nomads have no place in the drive for an Africa that is more prosperous and efficient, and many governments are pursuing policies that will soon eradicate their way of life. But as long as they do exist, they provide a rare glimpse into a very distant past. Every year, the rains turn the swamps of the Sudan into an inland sea as large as England. Here, the Dinka people continue to follow a lifestyle developed generations ago. During the months of flooding, the Dinka retreat with their cattle to higher ground. Then, at the start of the dry season, they return. Visitors to the Dinka in the late 19th century were surprised by what seemed to be a complete absence of a regulatory social system. Where were the kings, courts, and government? The British colonial rulers went so far as to employ anthropologists in an attempt to find natural leaders who could be made into local officials. The anthropologists confirmed the fact that Dinkas recognized no leaders. Instead, the Wut, or cattle camp, forms the nucleus of Dinka society. and every individual within that society instinctively understands the role he or she has to play. The social order is not imposed from above, but leveled from within. And the very fact that until now such a precarious lifestyle has survived in such a hostile physical environment as the Sud swamps, with its flooding, its insects, and its disease, is proof of the strength of the pattern of Dinka society. Because so much of Africa's history is unwritten, it must be reconstructed in other ways. Every year, the young girls of Swaziland, a small country close to the southeastern tip of Africa, take part in a ceremonial reed dance in which they symbolically donate reeds to build the Queen Mother's house. By looking at the traditions of its rural communities, like the annual reed dance of Swaziland, anthropologists can begin to understand something of the story. Archaeologists, too, must dig in the dirt of Africa to learn its past. The earliest explorers sometimes glimpsed a truth about Africa which others who came later would not see. In 1498, Vasco da Gama and his men went ashore on the east coast of Africa to find tall stone cities, where the people knew as much about charts and compasses as the Portuguese did themselves. The Europeans who came afterwards neither understood the continent nor wanted to. They created the myth of darkest Africa, terra incognita, the white man's grave, and Africa was not to escape the destructive effects of enforced contact with Europeans. Many of her peoples suffered the abuse of the transatlantic slave trade, which went on for over 300 years. Later, when the European states divided the continent up amongst themselves with ruler and set square, they created colonial possessions that ignored all the natural and historical divisions of race, religion, language, and culture. They did their best to eradicate the old pattern of Africa altogether. It is proof of the power and resilience of this mighty continent, and eloquent testimony to its many peoples, that they failed.